Thank you for joining us, the Department of Records, for this virtual event in conversation, surveillance, archives, and impact. Before we begin, I'll give a little housekeeping. Tonight's event will include a short introduction by me about the agency and our two speakers, and then we'll witness this engaging conversation, followed by a Q&A at around 7 p.m. Please type your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll share them with the speakers. So folks are still cycling in, but to be mindful of everyone's time, I'm just gonna begin. So my name is Yani Aviles, and I am the Public Programming Officer for the New York City Department of Records and Information Services, DORIS for short. We house the city's municipal archives and library, our mission being to foster civic life by preserving and providing access to the historical and contemporary records of New York City government and its peoples. I want to welcome our two speakers tonight. Kameron Neal is a Lucille Lortel and Princess Grace award-winning artist and designer working in film, installation, and performance. Recent projects include Dark Disabled Stories with Ryan J. Haddad, Whiteness with Paul Pinto, Mukagni with Sheok Nisha Chaudhary, and For What It's Worth with Billy Porter. Kameron's work has also been seen in the New York Times, Forbes, National Geographic, Hypebeast, and has been presented at various institutions, including BAM, Ars Nova, Culture Hub, Digital Graffiti, New Orleans Film Festival, Ann Arbor Film Festival, Gregg Museum of Art and Design, Williams College Museum of Art, and Sound Scene at the Smithsonian's Hirshhorn Museum. And Chris Nicols is the audiovisual archivist at the New York City Municipal Archives. He holds a master's degree from NYU and has previously worked at StoryCorps, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, and the Miami-Dade College Wilson Archive. At the NYCMA, he manages collections of 20th century municipal journalism from WNYC TV and radio and the Channel L Working Group, as well as undercover surveillance footage recorded by the NYPD. Chris volunteers with the nonprofit group Transfer Collective, which partners with traditionally marginalized creators and community organizations to lower the barriers to preserving at-risk audiovisual media. So welcome me in joining these two speakers tonight for this riveting conversation. And I am going to hand it over to Kameron and Chris to begin. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction.
So Kameron, we've talked about this collection a couple of times before. There's always a lot to talk about, and we won't talk about everything that I know we would love to talk about in the time that we have tonight. But before we get into that, do you want to talk a little bit maybe about your previous works, just so we have some context for who you are as an artist and how you've come to this collection?
Sure. Yeah, I'll share my screen, talk about a couple projects, just to introduce myself to folks that might not necessarily know me or my work, and then we can dive in. I was gonna ask if folks can see this, but we're in a webinar, so no one will respond to me. But yeah, as Yani mentioned, I'm a designer and an artist, and that work takes many different forms. But a lot of the work that I've been making recently is kind of working in video and installation and thinking a lot about, I guess, kind of what it means to kind of engage with video in 3 dimensions. So this is a project here that I made in 2018 called Groundwater. And this was at the Digital Graffiti Festival in Alice Beach, Florida, which is this little neighborhood on the Gulf, and all of the architecture is white. And every year, I think they just had the festival, but every year they have this projection festival where artists are able to project on the facade of these buildings. So this is a 2-channel piece that I made that was really thinking about it's a self-portrait of sorts, and was really thinking about my body in relation to the water and rising tides and kind of the share of bodily fluids inside of like intimate exchanges. So it's this this loop, and you'll see this kind of line of people here, because this was at the entrance of the festival, projected on these two adjacent buildings. And this is a project that I did in 2020 at the Public Theater's Under the Radar Festival. Rest in peace to that festival. But yeah, it's a piece I made in collaboration with my partner, Misha, and it's this kind of like autobiographical, we were calling it like an automythography in some ways, like a multimedia performance memoir, that we both co-created, that I video designed, and that he directed. And in this piece, we were thinking a lot about death and the body, and essentially trying to answer the central question of like, what do we want to happen to our bodies after we die? You know, so I'm a Black American raised in the South, and he is Bengali, and we were just thinking a lot about the kind of cultural differences and what that means, in terms of like funerary practices, and thinking about, I guess, what it means to kind of send off a loved one, and like maybe ideas of the afterlife as well. So yeah, there's a lot of video in this piece and projection on our bodies. And I think in some ways really kind of felt like an art installation that we were performing inside of. This is a piece I did at Culture Hub in 2022. It's kind of an ongoing project that I've been working on in collaboration with Paul Pinto, who's this incredible composer, musician, and performer. And the piece is called Whiteness. And we initially actually started working together during the pandemic, and made this kind of like dense music video where he was thinking a lot about, he's mixed race, he was thinking a lot about his own proximity to whiteness and like what that has meant historically, you know, looking a lot at US Census records and kind of considering how those categories have changed and evolved with time. And his music and his writing is really, it's really dense, it's really verbose, it's really fast. And we'd initially made it as a music video for this online, I guess the festival's not online, but it was online because of the pandemic, but this opera festival called Prototype. And then we were like, oh, maybe what would it mean to kind of expand this project and think about it in 3 dimensions, and to think about it as an installation. So this is like documentation of that. Then you'll see there's his floating head is like duplicated many times, and sometimes there's like 40-part harmonies, and all of these heads are kind of singing at you and whirling around you. So yeah, it's an ongoing project, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to continue working on it and share more of that, I think later this year, actually. And the last piece I'll talk about is kind of the most recent thing that I worked on. I also work as a projection designer for theater and performance. And I worked on this piece called Dark Disabled Stories, which was written by Ryan J. Haddad, and it happened at the Public Theater. And it's this piece that, you know, it's really kind of sharing a lot of, to back up. So Ryan is disabled, he has cerebral palsy, and the show is really kind of thinking about what it looks like to kind of navigate the city and to navigate the world as someone with a disability, as someone that uses a walker, like he does. But it's also like very humorous in some ways. And as a part of the kind of design conceit of the show, we were really interested in thinking about accessibility and like this idea of radical accessibility, and what it might mean like to make a show that is accessible to folks that are deaf and accessible to folks that are blind and low vision. So as a part of the kind of design conceit for the show, here's another image. All of the language was like captioned in real time, which was my role as a designer on the piece. And then Dickie was an actor, a deaf actor who was a performer in the show. And he was using ASL alongside Ryan. And then there was also another performer named Alejandra, who was kind of in this role as the describer, and so she was essentially kind of like describing the stage picture and everything that was happening in real time, to kind of make the show as accessible as possible. So yeah, that's some of my like recent work. Maybe I should go ahead and like talk about the residency as well, and then we can like rejoin. Yeah, so I'm currently a public artist in residence with the Department of Records. And it's kind of worth saying, or kind of talking about the kind of origin story of this residency to some degree. It's like modeled after this artist, Meryl Latimer Nicols, who was doing a lot of conceptual and performance work in the 70s and 80s, and was kind of like the first artist to insert herself into like the municipal government agency. And she was inside of the Department of Sanitation, and she's like still there to this day, making work. But this was a piece that she did called Touch Sanitation, where she essentially like looked all the sanitation workers in the eye and shook their hand as like this acknowledgement of their labor in this kind of performative act. So this residency that I'm like currently a part of was very much modeled after her work, and feels like a continuation of the legacy of the many things that she was doing. Yeah, maybe that's enough for now.
A lot more to get to, but I think before we start getting into what you did at your residency, let's just give some people some background on what the NYPD collection is, how the Municipal Archives got it. Because as I was watching you go through your previous projects, I was struck by how, in a lot of ways, the NYPD surveillance film collection is so different than anything you've really worked with before. So the NYPD collection, I'm not sure how much people have read about this before coming here, but basically from 1960 to 1980, the NYPD's Bureau of Special Services, or BOSS, sometimes Bureau of Special Services and Investigations, BOSSI, they recorded social activist communities, individuals, organizations on black and white, very small film cameras. And the people who would actually do the recording were all plainclothes. So people would not know that they were police officers who were recording them. For the most part, these were recorded on the street, on the public. It is legal for the police to do this, just as it's legal for people on the street to record the police if they want to. In the mid-1970s, a group of Black Panthers sued the NYPD because they believed that the NYPD was actually harassing them, that they were breaking the law in some of the way that they were conducting the surveillance. They won. This resulted in something called the Handshoe Agreement that curtailed or controlled the way in which the NYPD was allowed to conduct surveillance on New Yorkers. Since September 11th, the Handshoe Agreement has been degraded a little bit. The NYPD has gained more powers to conduct more surveillance. And certainly the 1960s was not the beginning of NYPD surveillance. There's a very long history throughout the 20th century that led up to that and still continues today. The Municipal Archives got this collection. I always feel like I'm getting something wrong when I tell this story because it just feels so silly. But I please, anyone chime in and correct me if I'm wrong. But years ago, I think 7 or 8 years ago, someone at the NYPD contacted one of my coworkers at the Municipal Archives. They were concerned that there was a collection of nitrate film that the NYPD had in a storage room. Nitrate film is actually highly explosive. It was one of the first types of film that was used. It's beautiful if you see it ever projected, but it catches fire so easily that there's a lot of legal stipulations around how it can be disposed of. So the NYPD was genuinely concerned that they needed to go through a number of safety steps in order to dispose of a whole room of films that they had. No one around the NYPD still knew it was on those films. It's sort of been lost to internal record keeping at the NYPD. My coworker went over to the NYPD headquarters. That's only a block away from the Municipal Archives headquarters at 31 Chambers Street. They went over and looked at the films, realized pretty quickly what the films were. And just to set the scene, the films were in a room where there was a, is it stalactite or stalagmite when it's like pointing down? And I always forget. Um, there
Someone
was
chime
a,
in the chat. Someone knows.
yeah, does anyone know? Well, there was a big salt formation hanging from the ceiling that was just, as water had been dripping down. There was one particularly large film that acted as a shield for the other films. It was caked with salt. This is just to give an indication of how much this had been forgotten. So my coworker put all the films into some laundry carts that he wheeled over from the municipal archives and made several trips with a few other coworkers. I was not working there at the time. I cannot take credit for this incredible, what is honestly just an incredible heroic act of archival salvation for these films. And once the 1,450 film collection had been moved to 31 chambers, then the NYPD was informed of what the films were, that they had been acquired by the municipal archives. To my knowledge, the NYPD has never stalactite. Thank you. It was a salt stalactite. To my knowledge, the NYPD has never been upset about this. They've never expressed any frustration about the way that these films were acquired. My understanding is that everyone who might have been involved in this surveillance program at the NYPD has long since retired. I know that some of them are still alive, and I think we'll talk a little bit about them. But there's no one at the NYPD who was involved in this program since it shifted, it morphed in to a different shape by the 1980s. I don't want to forget anything before we move on. Well, okay, so it's there's about 75 hours. They're all black and white. They're all silent. They're all handheld cameras, which gives a weird sense of almost looking like a cell phone camera today. They were all scanned. I scanned all of them over the course of 2019. They're all scanned at 4K. I would love to take credit for how high quality the scans are, but really it's because we got a really nice scanner. And so the resulting films just look really fantastic. And another thing about film to keep in mind is that film can last for over 1,000 years if it's stored properly. And at the Municipal Archives, I'm very happy to say that we are storing those films properly. So even if something happens with all the digital files that we created, it's possible to scan them again. We will not lose them. They're gonna stick around for a long time. Okay, so let's get into just what it was like, Kameron, for you to start looking at this film collection. Like I said, it's so different than any of the things that you showed. I noticed there's a lot of different kinds of color in a lot of the things that you worked on. This is black and white. There's
Specifically a lack of color. Yeah.
Yes. Do you want to talk about that first sort of what drew you to the collection, what interested you in it?
Yeah, and I'm like I'm trying to remember what I said about the residency. Maybe it's also worth saying, yeah, I think the idea of the residency is to like insert artists into New York City government to be kind of civic partners and like creative thought leaders around like inside of the agency, and to kind of come up with ideas about how an artist might kind of engage with these bureaucratic systems in some ways. So I applied for this residency. In the call, there was like a mention of the NYPD surveillance films and like some other collections. And I really didn't know much about the collection. I was just online. It's worth saying that these films are digitized and are available to look at online. So in the process of applying for the residency, I just started kind of poking around and looking at these films, and it just felt like such a kind of incredible historical record. I think I was also just at first just like really moved by the quality of them. I think I didn't really know what to expect, or I think a lot of people have ideas around what a surveillance film might look like, and I think because it's like handheld and like on the street, it felt so close and it felt so intimate, and it felt so like human in some ways, which is weird to say because I feel like we're talking about a thing that is certainly complicated in the fact that that these films exist and what they were like there to do and how they affected people's lives. But there was really just this like haunting beauty inside of it that I was really drawn to. So I started the residency and was like, I know I'm interested in these films, but I also wanted to be really open. And because I mean, the archives are just so massive and there's like so many different directions that I could have gone in. So I think I spent some time looking at like the WNYC TV collection or researching that, which was really incredible, which I know you also touched a lot of that, Chris. And yeah, and very early on into the residency, we kind of had like what they were calling like a brown bag period, which was like a time for me to like introduce myself to the agency and was also a time to just kind of start talking to folks and just understand how things work and how things operate. So from very early on, we were connected and just had like an initial conversation around the collection and started to kind of start to share some inklings and kind of first impressions around what was inside the collection.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. They are all available online. You can browse all of them. They all have inventory IDs. I hope it's easy to look through them and browse through them. Um, the inventory that we have that we created, we adapted it from this logbook that the NYPD had kept to order new surveillance. So it's not like it was an inventory that was created after the fact by the NYPD. It was just sort of something that was made as they went forward. And um, I should also say that the films that you can find online on our gallery, those are not the full quality version, because the full quality film is very high resolution. It's actually, if you get to see it cleaned, repaired, and not damaged, it's extremely high quality. So you can find higher quality versions by request at the municipal archives. And so I'm kind of getting to us talking about this one specific film that we were both drawn to immediately. I think that you started describing it, and I think I just quoted the number right away, and you were like, "Yes, that number. That's the number of that film," because it's such a the there's 1,450 films. They cover a really broad set of subjects. The two largest subjects are protests against the Vietnam War and protests against segregation in the United States. But those two subjects combined only make up about a third of the whole collection. It's a lot of content on it, but it's still, there's so many other things that they cover. But this film in particular, I feel like I should just play it because we can talk over it since it's silent. But I will share my screen. Hopefully this goes well. Okay. Can you see that?
I can see it.
I hope everyone else can. Okay. So yeah, this is 85-1. It's from 1963. It's a protest organized by the NAACP, the New York State chapter of the NAACP. It is a protest of the construction of Rochdale Village, which exists in Queens today. It was supposed to be an integrated housing community, but they were using all white labor unions in order to build it. And since it was such a massive construction project, these were going to be jobs that would last for years. They'd be high paying jobs. Obviously, people of color were being cut out of that. There is a man here who will show up in a little bit named William H. Booth. He was the president of the New York State chapter of the NAACP. A few years after this, he became a member of Mayor Lindsay's Human Rights Commission. He ended up becoming a judge in New York City government and serving for a very long time. I think he passed away in the early 2000s. This guy actually just walks over to this crowd. He's got a tie on. He's got these short sleeves. He's kind of ambulating in front of everyone. You can see sometimes he's sort of trying to rein people in, I think. So this protest ended up, something actually that you should notice in the background is that there are families here. Kameron, I don't want to take all the time to talk about this. If there's something you want to say.
Yeah, for sure. Also, just to kind of name what's happening here, people are like chaining and linking themselves together to stop these cement trucks from like entering the construction site. So it's this act of trying to, I guess, bring visibility to what's going on and like literally slow down the construction to kind of shift who's able to like engage with this labor. And I just happened to like stumble upon this film randomly very early I wasn't even sure that I like wanted to make a project about this collection. I had like no system. I was just on the website clicking on random films, just like trying to see um what was there. And then this film, I guess we're like waiting for the moment. But this film in particular really struck me.
Yeah, because you know, like I said, there are families in the background of the protest earlier. This is what these families were doing that day. As far as I can tell, the officer, you know, he used the first 2 minutes of this 3-minute film to record the protest. He stopped for whatever reason, and then he took the camera home with him, and he just decided to make a little home movie, probably one that he never watched, that maybe no one ever watched, and it just sort of shows this other family on the same day, or maybe in the same week or something. This is what they're doing with their day, and it just, there's not a lot you really have to add to that.
Yeah, and I think what's so fascinating about the collection is, I mean, there's just so little that we like know about it, kind of beyond that logbook, which I think, you know, mostly has the dates. Maybe it has the reason why they were at a specific like protest or demonstration, and then sometimes has like the last name of the officer, and that's kind of like the bulk of what there is to to pull from, initially at least. And yeah, so I think I was just kind of cruising through, saw this film, and it really like struck me to kind of see the like dichotomy of what was happening in these two worlds. Like there are these Black folks and Black families that are like demonstrating to be able to have like an integrated like labor workforce for this like huge housing complex in Queens. And then on the same roll of film, maybe this happened on the same day, but at least like the same officer was in both locations. And then you kind of see the giddy joy of these like little white kids. And just to kind of, I don't know, to think about the space between those two worlds and the officer and that camera being the kind of constant between them, like really struck me and really kind of became the seed for my project, which I'm realizing I haven't specifically said what the project is. Maybe I'll say that now before
Sorry, yeah, my bad. That's
folks
my bad.
like, no, it's totally fine before it's too late. But yeah, so my project that will be happening June 16th through the 18th at the Brooklyn Army Terminal Annex building. It's called Down the Barrel of the Lens. And essentially this film kind of feels like the seeds of what this like film installation became. I sat through this like entire collection and found moments in the films when folks looked into the camera, when they essentially like acknowledged that they were being surveilled by the NYPD. And I think some folks knew that it was the NYPD surveilling them, some folks did not. But there's kind of this range of reactions to being recorded, and it really kind of highlights this like power dynamic in terms of like who feels kind of free to be giddy and like jokey with this camera. And then there's also like moments with like the Black Panthers that are very much like, I know what you're getting at, or and maybe I'm like reading into their looks a little bit. But it's kind of this like range of human reactions to what it means to be recorded and what it means to be surveilled. So that will be up at next Friday, which is very soon. But I hope you all will like come out and experience that. And at the end of this talk, I'll share a little clip from the film.
Yeah, it's really striking how much intimacy is in all these films. I think that you really picked up on that, and the different, who is intimate in what ways, how well, you know, one of the other things that you picked up on that I think that you were particularly interested in was the personal moments that you see of the NYPD, and that through this collection being preserved, it's not just, you know, people who, the ostensible reason why all these were created was because the NYPD was pursuing a mission of ensuring the safety and security of the people of New York. And then, you know, you also find that they're human beings who sometimes they're just goofing around. They're just having a fun day at work, and it's fun to play around with cameras. And so I want to just go right into the next film that that we've got lined up here. And most of the time, I think most of the films, it's pretty obvious what they're recording. It's a lot of the time it is just protests. They're going out to a public protest. Activists have told me that police still record protesters today. I mean, this is still something they do in order to sort of keep tabs on people, even if they don't suspect people are breaking the law. It's just a part of policing tactics to keep tabs on activists.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying, I think you had mentioned the kind of handshoe decree, and this surveillance is still going on. It just takes, it takes different forms. It looks differently than it did back then. I think, and this is like an example of, this is one of the officers, and he's actually pointing the camera at another officer. There's another clip that shows the other perspective there. But I think what was so kind of striking when I started looking at this collection is that the surveillance felt so tangible in a way. I think now it's like, oh, maybe they're scraping our social media. There are like 20,000 cameras on like the streets of New York recording our activities. There's like gunshot detection software and so many different ways in which their surveillance feels, it feels harder to pin down. And yeah, I think I was just really struck by actually seeing it in effect.
How do you feel like looking into, these sort of more intimate moments that the NYPD had that, where you're seeing throughout most of the collection, they're peering into other people's moments of honestly like heroism, moments of great bravery, really important moments in people's lives. And now we're also seeing these sort of more vulnerable moments where the NYPD is just goofing around. They're not being, this doesn't look like a police force. This just looks like two guys who are goofing around at the office.
Yeah, I mean, it's really like, it feels really complicated and it feels hard to like, hard to think about in some ways. But I think the moment that I wanted to point out is coming up soon. But yeah, right here, there's like this cigarette stop motion, they're just like kind of goofing off in this space and are making, I don't know, it's like this weird art film from the NYPD. And, I think I, came into this with my own kind of preconceived ideas about the NYPD and about policing and kind of what that's meant historically and what that means for Black folks and like different kind of political and social movements. And it feels, I'm trying to like, I don't know, it feels hard to watch these in some ways and feel how, I guess it feels like they're being like humanized and there's a connection to them. And I actually like feel connected to them in some ways when you see them in this context, when you see them kind of at home in a way, like just being joking and playful with one another. And it feels so different from kind of how I imagine policing in the world.
Sorry, I just lost my train of thought for a second. Um,
Yeah, no worries. I think it's also,
Please go ahead.
yeah, maybe we could like move into some of the, or I guess to like talk about that clip a little bit more. I've come into this residency as an artist. I'm not an archivist. I'm not a historian. I think in many ways, this, this residency was also challenging for me in some ways in trying to like find my footing and like learn what it actually means to do research and to like dive into these collections and understand them. And I think that last clip, I'm like really drawn to it in some ways because I think I think a lot of people come to this collection. I think there are many reasons why people will come to the collection. And, maybe they're looking at a specific political movement or a specific group of people and kind of want to see how that was portrayed like through the NYPD's lens. But like me as an artist, I'm also like so interested in these moments in between. I'm like, oh yes, there's all of this documentation of the Vietnam War and all these other things, which is really moving and striking in some ways. But then there's also all of these like human moments inside of it that are captured that I think are so tender and like moving in some ways, even though it is like at its heart like a surveillance film from the NYPD. I know that there were some, I think you wanted to kind of hit on some of the Vietnam footage in the collection, right?
Yeah, you reminded me of what I wanted to say though before we move on from that. So I had mentioned that the collection comes from the NYPD's Bureau of Special Services. That's the organization who would order the surveillance. They would do the research, the background kind of detective research to know upcoming protests, where they would happen, when they would happen. But the people who were actually doing the recording itself were from a group called the Photo Unit of Manhattan. Basically, it was the photo unit for the entire city of New York. But for what most of the work that these people would be doing would be crime scene photos or mugshots. They did all the kind of photography work for the NYPD. And so there is actually disconnect between the people who are the officers who are really invested in this investigatory work, and then the photographers who go out and actually conduct the recordings. And that also makes me want to say that before we started digitizing this, we didn't know how well shot these were. We didn't know if they would actually look very good. We didn't know if, maybe there were lots of technical problems with them. Like you said, people have this sort of idea of what a surveillance film looks like. And I think that there is a certain level of artistry that these photographers are bringing to this. Not all the time, but sometimes there are shots that just, they look beautiful. It's a well
Yeah.
lined up shot, and you can tell that this is a photographer who knows what they're doing. And so there is, I wonder if instead of being done by the photo unit of Manhattan, who were experienced photographers, if it was just done internally by the Bureau of Special Services, what they would look like. But yeah, let's get into these Vietnam films. Let me make sure that I have the right one here. Yeah, so there's something that I think is really interesting about the Vietnam films is that you really do get to see how much, well, these films, all of them actually, because it goes from 1960 to 1980, and it bears repeating. There was so much change that happened very quickly sometimes, at least just in the basic way that people looked and the way that they dressed. So I'll share this video. So this is one of the earliest Vietnam protest films. I think this is from 1963. You can see, all the signs are really, really legible. It's pretty clear what everything's about. Um, I think most of these people look like they're middle-aged. They look like they could be dressed going to an office. And so some of the films are shot in a way where it's very clear that the NYPD is trying to identify people. They are trying to get shots of people's faces, so that they can come back and find these people later and keep tabs on them. In addition to these surveillance films, we also have a lot of still photography, and just we have boxes and boxes of note cards just with profiles of people that the NYPD was keeping tabs on during this period of time. But
Yeah, and I
again,
think
go ahead.
I was going to say, I think it's worth saying, like, and as a part of my process and a part of like my research and diving into these films, so there's like this collection of films. Then there was also like the hand shoe collection, which I think is like still being processed, which is just like records and records of like police reports. So it's been really fascinating to kind of find moments inside of these films and then look at the hand shoe collection and see literally like sometimes it'll have a breakdown of exactly what happened at this demonstration, and like people's license plate numbers, everything that was on the placards, maybe even like a flyer from the demonstration with notes on the back of it that is like handwritten notes from a certain officer. So it's been kind of a fascinating process of like seeing these films and then also looking at all of these police reports and notes from the NYPD to kind of understand what it was that they were doing there and what they were kind of gleaming from these different demonstrations and who they were focused on. And I think another like basic thing that like really kind of struck me in watching this collection is just maybe it's also worth saying I'm trained as a graphic designer, so I also have a love for typography and language in that way. So it was really just striking to, I guess, understand like the relevance of the placard and the protest sign, which like maybe seems obvious in some ways. But even when you're seeing these films out of context, it's so, it's so clear what the message is and what people are doing there. And it feels like this way of kind of I don't know, almost like ensuring the legacy and ensuring the message continues through time. And yeah, I just hadn't really realized until seeing this collection how just kind of how essential that is to carrying on the messaging.
Well, it's funny you say that because I'll play this next video where I feel like you need a lot of context to understand what's happening here. So this is a later Vietnam War protest film. This is, I think, in Central Park. I think it's like 1968.
Yeah, I think so.
This is just a mob of, I think, Vietnam War protesters. They've surrounded a police car, right? Do you want to talk about this, Cameron?
Yeah, so this is there's some clips from this that I've used in the film installation. I think, I've been really interested in just what is this relationship to policing. And you'll see, I guess, earlier on that folks are kind of surrounding this police car, and this was like a big Easter Sunday. I think it was called the Central Park BN demonstration. And I think this is really kind of evidence of how the movement has shifted. I think these people look very different from the earlier films, and it really feels like a moment in the counterculture. And you'll see here that they're now kind of looping around this police car, and that the officer is like inside of this like merry-go-round. And then also kind of this moment of them capturing this couple making out. And I think what's so fascinating about it is like, the NYPD is there for a certain reason to do a specific job. And I'm like, why are you recording this? There's just
There
this
are
kind of
lots of times like that. This is not the only time where there's like a certain gaze that is happening. Like it's very clear. There's some times where it's like the NYPD, the officer doesn't seem like they really care that much about the security concerns that are being recorded. They just care about like this cool thing that's happening in front of them, or like some people kissing or something or making out. Yeah.
yeah, it's fascinating to kind of get a glimpse of the person through these recordings and through these films. And yeah, and some of it, I don't know, there are like kind of compromising moments at some parades of like zooming in on people's bodies in ways that are uncomfortable. And I'm like, you were on the job. Like what is this?
But also it sort of speaks to I'm not sure how much oversight there was over this program. I don't know. Um, I mean, there was obviously a lot of controversy with the handshoe agreement. There is a book. If anyone is interested in learning more about the shape of this program, the resource I think that both Cameron and I used was this book called Police Intelligence, written by a NYPD detective named Anthony Buzza. I think he left in 1975 to pursue his master's degree. He wrote this book as an explanation, as a way to get his master's degree. But also, I mean, he talks about uh, believing very much in the mission of the Bureau of Special Services in the 1950s as a way to combat communism. But then I think that he gets disillusioned by the 1960s or 70s and feels that the organization has sort of lost its way and is no longer an effective tool for keeping the people of New York safe. Later on, he would become the police commissioner of Milwaukee for a long time. He is still around today. Um, but yeah, I love how much you can see. That's a Vietnam War protest. People look a lot different than the first film that I showed. I think that I want to show this next film because I think that it really ramps it up. I think this is just a year later. And it shows not just that people are dressing really differently, but something I think is really interesting and I didn't really realize is that the Vietnam War and protests against the Vietnam War become a rallying cry or a center point for so many other movements and so many other um, struggles in the United States, cultural struggles in the United States, see Vietnam as a larger metaphor for so many different things that are going wrong in American culture. So this is Central Park again.
Oh, I think I was reading an article because I think this was because there was like the Central Park BN that happened, and I think the messaging of that, it was very much like the messaging of love, and then it feels like then there was a shift where the message kind of became more pointed and was more about like just stopping the war.
I think that the way that the NYPD titled this one was peace protest.
Mm.
And I should say that the all the titles that you're going to find online on the galleries, they come from the NYPD titles. And so we've tried to preserve that as much as possible. Sometimes they're just inaccurate. Sometimes they're just wrong, or the title only describes like the first 30 seconds of the film, and then the film takes place somewhere else, or it's of a different event. So just keep that in mind when for anyone who's browsing the films online. You can see in a lot of these films, Attica becomes a huge deal. It shows up in so many of these things. Symbols of Black power. The Black Panthers become a lot more prominent starting in the 70s, and also the United Black Action Front, I think, is another organization that shows up in a fair amount of these starting in the 1970s. I don't think that there are any films that specifically call for the end of the Vietnam War. But it's signs that say like peace now. It's obvious what it's about, but it's also just become about so much more and so many different things.
I also remember reading some article from like around the time of this, and people were just like complaining about how all of like the counterculture was ruining Central Park with this demonstration. The sanctity.
You know, it's also really interesting to think about 1960 to 1980 is sort of like it is the beginning of a very, very dark time in New York City's history. And that 1960, you could still say things are not so bad. But by the end of this whole thing, I mean, New York is in a really bad place by 1980. And I'm not from New York. I was not familiar with just how bad things were. Though work that I've done on other collections at the Municipal Archives has given me some insight into how difficult things got. I think that's
Was
all the
that the
films.
last one?
Yeah, we've still got a little bit more time. I'm just making sure that we talk about everything that we wanted to talk about before the end of this. Are there any? Oh yeah, I wanted to ask: are there any films that you were really interested in but didn't end up being included in your end project?
Yeah, so in the project, I was, really only, I basically watched through the collection, and mostly in chronological, I guess it's in chronological order until like the very end. And there are some things that are like not labeled and it's not necessarily clear. But yeah, I watched it through in chronological order and was really just focusing on all the moments when people looked into the camera. But yeah, there's so much like, I'm trying to think of a specific thing. I think, we talked about some of the incredible stuff that like the Bread and Puppet Theater was doing during those demonstrations, and just like thinking about like radical performance art and costume, and it's like those like the images and like that they elicited and created were so moving and so striking. So I think some of that stuff was really moving to me. Yeah, I'm trying to think of other specific films that were like really blew me away. I tried to include all the things that I could.
Maybe you can talk about the process of how you got from watching these films to the end result, because I think you had a couple of different ideas along the way.
Yeah, so basically the way that like the residency works is I signed on, and maybe it's worth saying that I started this residency in 2021. So it's been like 2 years now that I've been kind of focused on this and working on this project. And for the first phase of it, it's just, they kind of name it as the research phase. And it's just a time to dive in and explore and just get acquainted with the agency and kind of find the project inside of it. And, I really had a hard time figuring out what it was that I wanted to do. Like I, yeah, like I knew early on that I was drawn to this collection, but I was like, I don't know what, it was hard for me to find what the project inside of the collection was. So I'm like, I know you, I'm sure you could make many incredible like documentary films out of this collection. But I don't know, like as an artist, if that's how I like specifically want to approach this material. So yeah, I proposed a lot of different ideas around like how like what it might be like to engage with the collection. I think initially I was like, and I guess it's worth saying that the doing all this research on the surveillance that the NYPD was doing in the 60s through the 80s, I was also like learning so much about what the present day surveillance infrastructure looks like in the city. And so initially I was trying to figure out how, like, what would it be like to merge and talk about both of those things at once inside of one project. So one idea I had was like, if there are 20,000 surveillance cameras in the city, do I somehow like make a surveillance camera an augmented reality filter? And then you could see like a surveillance film from the 60s that happened in that same location. I'm also, was thinking a lot about doing a kind of like mass um, performance for the present day surveillance cameras in the city. Like, what would it be like to do a mass performance for 20,000 cameras simultaneously across the city, which I think is an idea I'm still interested in. If anyone wants to help fund that, let me know. But yeah, but I think I had proposed these ideas, and then but it felt like a kind of missed opportunity in some ways, because I was like, these films are so incredible, and I feel like I feel like I would regret walking away from this residency and not really engaging with this collection. So yeah, so I think that's kind of how Down the Barrel of a Lens was born, and it was really like it was like a long process of moving through all of these films, and like I had this like Excel spreadsheet kind of taking like copious notes about all of the films and being like at 36 seconds this person looked into the camera, and just trying to like come up with some type of system to be able to keep track of what all these moments were. So it was a long process of doing that, and then a long process of trying to get all the films to me, and then just many months of sitting with this material and trying to edit something together. So basically the way that the installation works, it's 2 channels. So there's 2 like projection surfaces, and they face one another, and they're like 80 feet apart. So one surface essentially is moments of civilians looking into the camera and acknowledging they're being surveilled. And the other surface is essentially like an abstracted like portrait of the NYPD, if you will. So it's moments of them inside of the photo unit, like hanging out with one another. It's moments of their shoes or their shadows, their kind of off moments when they've recorded themselves. So the installation is essentially recreating this encounter, if you will, and you as the audience member stand in the middle of these 2 films that are playing simultaneously. So you're kind of like implicated in this gaze as as the civilians and the police like look at one another. So that's how the installation works. Maybe I should just play a
Yeah.
little clip. So this clip, it's like the film itself is around 25 minutes long, and it will be playing on loop. And I'm just going to share like a short little 2-minute clip from the film, which is basically a moment when people, it's a series of moments when people start recording the NYPD with their own cameras, so kind of like subverting that gaze. And it would also be really fascinating to find all of the film and photos of people recording them. Maybe I'll get to that at some, maybe that's part 2. But yeah, here's a little tease of Down the Barrel of a Lens. wait, hold on, I'm gonna do this again because I think I might not have done the optimize for sound. All right, here we are. Oh, and that's me on my first day at the archives, which I didn't mean to
Stacks,
show.
yeah.
In the stacks.
That's great. Man, yeah, I love the effect that you went for. I mentioned it before. I love the audio that goes along with it. It really lends itself, I think, to the tone of the films. You could do a lot of different things with it, but yeah, this I think is a really good one. Thank you very much for working on that. And I'm just so happy to see these films getting used because, like you said, there's a lot in there. There's a lot in there, and I'm looking forward to seeing more people use them for more projects.
Yeah, I hope folks will dive in. I feel like we tried to touch on a couple of things today and like barely scratched the surface of the kind of incredible material that's in the collection. So yeah.
Yeah, the surveillance films of JFK 10 days before he's assassinated. There's footage, very intimate footage of Robert Kennedy's funeral in Manhattan, where I think Nixon shows up, Johnson shows up, a lot of other big public figures show up. Then all the surveillance that they did of the NASA astronauts, and it makes you wonder: were there
Those are
threats to
really
these?
incredible. Yeah.
Were they worried that NASA astronauts would be assassinated or attacked? Were they trying to ensure security for them or something? I don't know. Or did they just think that it was really cool that the NASA astronauts were having this parade? And is it understandable that police might be excited just as much as like a little kid might be excited about these astronauts in the space program or something?
Yeah.
I think that we're just about out of time, right?
Yeah, thank you both so much for that. That was really very interesting. And there's so many questions, as you can imagine. And again, I wish we could just talk forever. So maybe we'll have a part 2 to your part 2, Kameron. I'm going to hand it over to, wonderful. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Cynthia, to read some of your questions. And I think we should be able to get through to all of them because we have 30 minutes. But yeah, if you didn't get the chance to write down any questions, there's a Q&A box. I see folks using both the Q&A and the chat's totally fine. But just, type your question in either of those platforms and we'll get them to Kameron and Chris. All right, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Yanni. And thank you, Chris and Kameron. This was really fantastic. I'm so interested. I'm so excited about the event at the Navy terminal. The Army terminal. We have lots of questions, so I'll go ahead and get started. first of all, how can we access the films, the surveillance films, and are they indexed? Chris, that one's probably for you.
Yeah, I'm just getting the link right now that I can. Should I just post it in the webinar chat?
Yep, put it in the chat. Yeah.
Okay. So
And
this is our online gallery. Yes, they're all indexed. Every film has a number, has its own unique number. They've just about all of them have dates, and they all have titles. They give at least a little bit of a short description of the context. Yeah, you can find them all for free there. And if you want the higher quality versions, reach out to our research.
fantastic. Let's see. I should just say there's a lot of great information in the chat. So if you're looking for information on how to RSVP for Cameron's event and some other information about the agency, that's there, as well as a great article about how we brought in our collections by one of the lawyers who was involved, who shared that with us. He was involved in making that happen. So let's see. The next one was, what was the most challenging part about your project, Cameron?
Yeah, I think I touched on it a little bit. I feel like the most challenging part was just figuring out what the what the project
Yeah.
what the project wanted to be. It felt like I was like sitting on gold. I was like, I know that there is something inside of this collection. I just needed to like find out what it was. So yeah, I think that was the big challenge, because I think it just feels like there were so many possibilities. And maybe that's also why the project is like so broad. Like it's literally footage spanning 20 years. Like it's not actually focused on a specific group of people or specific demonstration. It's really wide reaching in that way. So I think kind of figuring that out and just figuring out where it wanted to live in the city, I think were the big
Yeah.
challenges.
I think that's a universal challenge for an artist is narrowing
Sure.
down your scope and figuring that out. One
Yeah.
question that keep coming up from several people is, are all the videos silent? Do any have sound?
I believe they're all silent, right?
I'm trying to remember. There's like 2 films that are in color, and I can't
Yeah.
remember if there's like one. No, I don't think there's any. I think they're all silent. They're all silent.
They're all silent. Okay, great. That was one of the big common questions. Kelly wrote, who owns the rights to the surveillance footage?
As far as I understand, it's just the city of New York owns it. It was created using taxpayer dollars. If the NYPD wants to go out and take a recording of you walking in the street, they can do that. They have done that. They have done that many times. And I think everyone who has walked through the city of New York exists on a lot of surveillance footage on the NYPD servers.
Sure. And then more specifically, this collection is owned by the Municipal Archives. We have the rights for all the films. Cameron, are you thinking about looking for any of the people who participated in events in any of the films? Or Chris too, do either of you have that interest to do
Yeah,
some
I'm
real
definitely
in-depth?
interested. Yeah, I see. So I think Joel has commented in the chat that they have like seen themselves in one of these films. Um, so maybe we should talk, Joel.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to um identify more folks and have more conversations and like learn more about this collection. And I hope that like by sharing this project that will facilitate more of those conversations, because it really is yeah, there's so much there. And there's so much more that I wanna learn about these materials. So I hope this is just the kind of beginning of that conversation.
Great. I was actually working at our counterpart event at Photoville with showing some of the videos and images, and several people said they recognized themselves in the images. So I think putting this out there is going to help facilitate that kind of thing. Let's see.
There's things that Cameron and I talked about was how much it feels like sometimes these are home movies, but of course they don't belong to the people who actually show up in them. And that there's a lot of moments of bravery and things that I imagine, a grandparent that might love to show to their grandchildren and say, look, this is what I did. And of course it's just in this weird situation. And hopefully this can, making them public, can bring back some
Yeah,
ownership.
absolutely. We have a comment here more than a question. The surveillance that occurred with minority communities and not in our counterpart communities. Really mind-boggling that the policing against the Black Panthers and Young Lords. So just something that someone commented about. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, because I'm just realizing now that, Cameron, we didn't talk about a certain topic that we did want to talk about, or that we mentioned talking about. There's this group called the Parents and Taxpayers Group. That is so complicated to talk about because they were a group that was there are a lot of protests about school integration, and I think most of them are what most people would imagine. They're protests that are in favor of integrating schools. A lot of them are sponsored by the NAACP or CORE, but there are also protests that are they're performed by this group called the Parents and Taxpayers Group. From my memory, they're all white. There are no members of the Parents and Taxpayers Group that are people of color. They're all white, and they're what they were protesting. Their explicit statement was that they supported integration, but that the specific way in which integration was being done was not going to work and it was not sustainable. And so there are definitely there's a fair amount of those protests. It's not most of them, most of the protests around school integration, but there's a significant number of them. And I would again point out that the protests against the Vietnam War, protesting about segregation, make up only a third of all of the content that are in these films. They are the two biggest subjects that are surveilled, definitely. But there are a lot of other subjects that are surveilled, like maybe 5 or 10 films at most. One of the other subjects that they definitely focused on, actually, this is not disagreeing with this point the person made, is that at a certain point, the NYPD became very interested in various Puerto Rican cultural events consistently year after year.
Okay, great. So you kind of touched on this. Were there many protesters later arrested by the NYPD, maybe through this footage that you know of? Did they use it actually to make any arrests or anything, or was it really more of a?
No, because actually I know that because if the films were ever used in a court proceeding, they would have been transferred to the New York District Attorney's Office. They would have become evidence, and so they would not have been in the possession of the NYPD.
Okay. Here's a good one, maybe for both of you. Do you feel differently about surveillance now after you've viewed all of these films?
Personally, I feel just like more aware of the surveillance. I think especially living in the city, and I think it's worth saying that, like, you know, the Handshoe decree, that was like in 71. I mean, there was just another class action lawsuit against the NYPD like a couple of months ago for the use of surveillance in the Black Lives Matter protest and using facial recognition software. So I feel maybe more paranoid and like I feel like significantly more aware of the ways in which I'm being surveilled immediately as I like leave my apartment. Yeah, it feels even more kind of pressing than I had even realized before I started this project.
Sure. Do you think, this is just my personal question because you kind of touched on it, do you have a different feeling about the surveillers, the photographers that were out there doing that? Because it's definitely different now where cameras are hidden cameras and whatnot. You know, you talked about a little bit about, you know, that they were real people, not just.
Yeah, I think it just feels like a different thing. I don't know. I don't want to like steer into like an AI
Yeah.
technology
No, yeah, of course.
I'm like, there's so many. Yeah, it's like it's a different beast. It's a different
Okay.
beast.
Yeah. Someone asked, this is kind of a multi-portion question. Do either of you know when forms to agree to be recorded as a media release came around or came into play in the city? And they also asked, do you know if these were handheld cameras or they hidden cameras, anything like that?
They were handheld cameras. Yes, they were definitely handheld cameras. When did forms come into?
Like consent
Like
forms.
release
So
forms. I have no idea.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, they're handheld cameras, and I think, you know, you see some of them in the in the films. I think that was also a thing that was kind of surprising to me, because when I think, when I think of kind of film recording at that time, I think of like a much bulkier camera setup, which I think a lot of folks were using. But I think for the most part, they were using these kind of small, it was like the Bell and Howell or like the Bolex cameras that I also think were used a lot like on the ground in Vietnam, because they were like nimble and were kind of ways that you
Yeah.
could kind of capture that footage. So yeah, those cameras feel very indicative of the time. But yeah, looking at them, they were like much smaller than I expected them to be.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
same. I think that
yeah.
was a big something that just adds so much character to this collection, is that they're handheld, and that to me personally, there's a certain motion to it that almost feels like having a cell phone. It feels a little bit modern.
Right. Let's see. Do either of you have any idea maybe how NYPD picked and chose who to tape, or what things were going on that might have led to that work?
I'm immediately thinking of like one of the last films that shows up is from 1980, and it's like a rollerblading marathon through like Prospect.
Okay.
And
Oh
it's like
yeah.
2 films, and it's there's some films where I'm like, okay, this is just like this open fair, and once I learn a little bit more details, I'm like, okay, there's like this one thing that sort of makes sense, that the NYPD would want to surveil this. For the life of me, I have no idea why they wanted to surveil this rollerblading marathon, but I mean, it's somehow, I guess there must have been some kind of security threat that was related to this rollerblading marathon, I guess. Okay.
Right.
I actually had like a slightly different read of some of that marathon footage, because there's also some. I remember like there are moments when you're seeing people like do the loop in Prospect Park. But then there are also some moments where it feels like there's like friendly banter with the person that's recording, and I was like, maybe some officers were participating in the marathon as well, like just. But I don't know. I'm just like speculating.
Okay. Interesting.
But yeah, I think
Uh,
it seems like it's a range of reasons. I think when you look at some of the reports, it's like, oh, it's very clear that they wanted to like surveil the specific individual or the specific group of people. But then there are so many things that I'm like, I don't know why, not necessarily, it's not clear why this was being recorded.
yeah.
Yeah, there's
Okay.
like a Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade, and whenever the camera turns on, somebody is like trying to jump out of the crowd into the parade route, and it sort of seems like, oh, the NYPD knew that something was going to happen, or that people were going to try to disrupt this parade, and that's why they're there recording it. But then
Yeah.
there's other times where it's just like there's the Harlem Youth Unlimited Festival, the HARU parade. I don't
Mm.
I don't remember anything happen. I don't remember people like disrupting it. It's just films of a parade. And if you didn't know it was the NYPD, you'd just be like, yeah, this is some news footage of this parade, I guess.
So is there any, that's a couple people wrote about this as well. Is there any footage that's too sensitive to be put online?
There were 2 films that the NYPD asked us to take down.
Right. Okay.
They're they don't look like any of the other films. It looks like if you're in like an old style New York apartment, and you're looking across to like another apartment, not across the street, but like in the space behind buildings, and it looks like you're looking into another apartment window, and it's at night, and there's like 2 men who are talking at this table. And I think that there was somebody mentioned that they thought, oh, maybe it's like an informant, and they're talking to this NYPD officer,
Right.
because it also, like, the people who are in this window, they look at the camera and they know they're being. Those are the only 2 things that they asked to take down. There
Okay.
is also an autopsy film.
Yeah.
I forgot about that. I
Yeah.
often try to forget about that, because it
Yes, I
is
would imagine.
Yeah,
Okay.
really jarring.
Yeah. Okay. Were there any do you know of if there were any still images extrapolated from the video recordings? Maybe by the police is what this person is meaning. But you might not know something like that.
Yeah, not that I know of. I mean, in my project, I am playing around with a lot of stop frames and playing around with stills from the collection, just as a form in the piece. But it's also worth saying that there is like an entire photographic collection, which I dug through a little bit of, but it's like boxes and boxes and boxes of photos. And like a lot of them are kind of drawn on and labeled to identify certain folks. So yeah, there's like a whole photography collection that I feel like is like a sister to this in some ways.
Yeah, we definitely have a huge, amazing NYPD photo collection. So let's see. So this one for Cameron, what's the significance of the shapes over the images and footage you presented?
Shapes over the images.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there were like some shapes that were, they didn't include that much of the video, but when you were presenting the video, there were like some, I wonder if they were like Zoom artifacts or something.
Oh, right. That could be because I actually think I saw
Oh
some of
yeah,
yours, Chris. Yeah.
maybe. I mean, Zoom is terrible for
Yeah.
trying to share
Yeah.
video. So yeah, maybe you have no sense of my project and you should come see it in person if you're
Yes.
able.
Oh, you definitely should come see it in person.
Definitely
The
go see
same
it in
person
person.
wrote, did you have any more specific hopes or goals for working with an artist in residence project?
Is that for me?
That's for you. Yeah. Do you hope to gain another residency? I think that's for you. Yes.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think as you had named, Chris, this project feels different in many ways from a lot of the other work that I have made. I think it's similar in form, and then I'm interested in thinking about projection and like spatial experiences that people can have. But I think in
Mhm.
terms of like the content, I've never really worked with like archival material in this way. I've never done a piece that feels this kind of like historically specific. And I really enjoyed the process. So I would really love the opportunity to dive into maybe more things in the Department of Records or other archives and see what else there is. I think this practice of kind of diving into archival material is really exciting to me. So I hope to do it
Great.
again. But there's also so much of the Department of Records. So I feel like I'm not done.
You're part of us now. Chris, you mentioned that you were glad the material is being used. I'm sorry. So this was a two-part question. I'm glad you answered, Cameron. But this poster wrote, Chris, you're glad the material is being used? Do you have more specific hopes or goals of working with other artists in residence or other ways of sharing the materials?
I mean, yeah, I definitely I put together our exhibit at Photoville, or at least I put together the video program that we have streaming there. And so I mean, I definitely have my own personal projects that I want to pursue with this, since it's hard to not, you sit with it for so many hours. Talking with Cameron was really nice because he's the only other person I know of who I think has actually watched through all 75 hours
Yeah.
of this content. And you can just sort of I think that when you get that in the weeds about any kind of collection, you want to talk about it, you want to explore it, and just wonder at a lot of things in it. But yeah, actually, I could. No, we don't. We have a lot more questions to get through, so I could play like a little video clip. But right now, what I'm personally doing is I'm pairing a lot of WNYC radio recordings that are contemporary to these silent surveillance films. So, for example, I've mentioned these NASA astronaut parades. We have a recording of the Gemini 3 mission ticker tape parade that was Gus Grissom in 1963. And the
Wow.
ticker tape parade, it just so happens that WNYC radio also covered that same parade. They talk about the weather, and it's raining a little bit in the parade on the footage. They talk about that weather, so it's very clearly it's from the same event. And I was just looking through like how can I pair things up. I found that recording, and then I listened to all of it, and like halfway through, um, they're in this foyer after the astronauts talk, and one of the anchors just says, "Oh, Jackie Robinson is here. Let's talk to Jackie Robinson." And Jackie Robinson comes up. I'd never heard his voice before. He comes up and just starts talking about the space program. He's there with his son and his friend, and they just talk about like what it was like meeting the astronauts, what the space program means for them, whether they want to be astronauts, whether they want to land on the moon, how scary and exciting that is. I just it's yes, I'm intensely looking forward to more people doing more things with this, because it's so overwhelmingly obvious to me how much potential there is in these
Yeah.
collections.
Definitely such a rich collection. So let's see, are any of the videos edited in any way? either by you or by the NYPD.
Cameron, you edited the videos extensively. I mean, you must have spent so many hours. I mean, now that I've done just a little bit of editing, for you to, a lot of the things, like you got some clips that are just like 2 seconds long, 3 seconds long. You really got into the weeds about editing those things down.
Yeah. My film is like heavily edited. But also, I guess, edited in terms of like isolating moments, but also in some ways wanting to kind of stay true to how things existed in the films. But I feel like the question might have been more about the films themselves, if they're edited. And to my understanding, I don't think they are. I think, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
Yeah,
There's
because
two
probably
films
wouldn't.
that are,
Or there are a
sorry.
couple longer ones that might be edited.
yeah, there's one that's the first papal visit to the Western Hemisphere is like a 45-minute long film, and it's a bunch of films that are edited together because it's a huge reel. And then the other film that is, I think it's edited for watchability, is the Apollo 11 astronaut ticker tape parade, which is also one of the only color films. And that's definitely edited. They made that, which of course, as soon as it's edited, it's not really, you can't use it as evidence in court as a surveillance film. It's been edited.
Sure.
So I think that was just because the NYPD thought that it was really cool that we had landed on the moon. They wanted to make a movie about it, I guess.
Maybe some of those
Okay.
like Columbia demonstrations too. I know that was a really long film, but
Mhm. Okay. Let's see. Someone asked if did you include the first video recording in your exhibition? Was the first one in number 1 included in any way, I guess?
85 one. Did you use that one, Cameron?
like the first one we talked about.
Yeah, I think so.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. That clip is certainly in there. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that one's too good to leave out.
Yeah.
Let me just see. I think that might be, let me see, did anything else come up? I think right now that is what we have for our questions. Let's see. We do have a couple minutes. If either of you want to make comments, or Chris, if you want to share your little video, your clip that you had, we can do that.
Sure, it's only a minute long.
Okay, let's do that. Yeah.
Mr. Deputy Mayor, WNYC FM is about ready to go into operation.
This problem. We still have a long, long way to go all over this nation before the problem is solved. But I'm
their own fate. Not only in Eastern Europe is communist barbarism broken forth beyond its own borders, on its Asiatic periphery, the Kremlin has made captive China and Tibet.
There are people in our society who are homosexuals who are being deprived of the right to shelter, a job, a chance to live, for no other reason.
That firmness in the right is indispensable today for peace. That firmness will always be measured. Its mission is peace.
Great. And that's part of the video that's part of the installation at Photoville, yes?
This is like a truncated version that just tries to show off like a couple of the breadth of all the subjects that are covered.
Yeah, amazing. All right. Any final thoughts from either of you?
I just want to say thank you all for attending. It's really been a gift to be able to do this residency and have time and space to dive into these materials and try to imagine what this can be. So yeah, I hope you all will come out to Down the Barrel of the Lens next week.
Yes. Fantastic. I'm very excited about it. I can't wait. I think Yanni probably has a last word to finish up.
Absolutely. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm pasting in the chat another link to RSVP for Cameron's exhibition, Down the Barrel of the Lens, and another colleague of ours, Latanya, just posted where you can find the exhibition that Chris Nicols curated at the Photoville Festival. Yeah, just this has been an amazing conversation. I think the collection is absolutely fascinating. And if you're interested in learning more, I'm also just going to paste some information about NYC Doris, the Department of Records. And please pay us a visit, by appointment, or, check out our collections online. Yeah, and I just want to give my deepest thanks to Kameron Neal and Chris Nicols for this conversation today. I mean, it's so relevant, ever relevant, as I feel like a lot of our programs are. And just, yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. And yeah, we hope to see you next weekend, the 3-day opening event. Thanks, Jessica, and everyone else. Have a good night, stay safe and be cool or warm or whatever you need. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you all. Good night.
You all take care.